How was the mausoleum opened? I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia. It was a summer job for a 16-year-old. It was a small, simple mausoleum, and other than that, flat earth with tombstones everywhere. The only surroundings were dense forest. That being said, due to the eerie surroundings, I was always a bit paranoid. Plus, I watch a lot of scary movies. So one night, I was doing my rounds and I had to go into the small mausoleum. It had some of the richer families in the area entombed within. I had to go in and make sure all was neat and clean. Standards need to be upheld for these yuppity folks. I approach and right off the bat, something was off. The air was pretty darn cold, even though this was during the summer in Georgia. There was also a light coming from the mausoleum. As I approached, I heard voices. Was it laughter? Laughter from a child? Maybe a little girl? Or maybe some kids had snuck in. I hadn't seen anybody leave the cemetery, and the laughter sounded young. As I got closer, the voice and the laughter died, like almost instantly. I paused. The light, I also noticed, had gone out. I called the security officer that does a few rounds on the lot because I'm not going in alone. We'll call him Officer Friendly. When Officer Friendly arrives, we both go in. We see one of the doors to the entombed remains of a young girl open. Nothing seems to have been disturbed, but it was still somehow open. A doll lay on the stone beneath it. Officer Friendly and I do a small sweep, which didn't take long. We close the door to the girl's entombment, and after we get about 30 feet from the mausoleum, we hear it, the voices and the laughter again. I jump. Officer Friendly nervously asks me, "You heard it too?" We look back and boom, lights flicker again. Laughter continues. We don't go back and we just book it. I found out the next morning that the door was open again, and this time the doll was on the other side of the mausoleum from where we found it the night before. I resigned the next day. Ghost Girl. My mom and stepdad were caretakers of a small cemetery for about 10 years. All of us kids, 6 of us between the 2 of them, helped out at one point or another. One summer, I was helping my mom with mowing and upkeep. It was a super hot summer, so we would try to go and get the mowing done early before the heat became too unbearable. Well, we had trouble getting the truck going the next day, so we ended up starting a little later than usual, and we were unable to finish up everything before the day it ended. My mom had an appointment the next morning, and the day after that it was supposed to rain. So I told her I would go up early the next morning and finish up the trimming with the weed eater. So it's about 7 a.m. in the morning, and I'm listening to my music with my headphones. Everything was going well until I got to the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was on a slope of a hill. When I finished up the last headstone, I turned off my equipment and started back up the hill. I glanced up in time to see a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running and disappeared behind a large headstone. I figured her parents were visiting another grave and a little girl ran off to entertain herself. It was around 9 a.m. at this point. I got to the top of the hill and there was no car or no people around. The cemetery wasn't really close to any houses, and the girl was too nicely dressed to have walked out there. I looked around and shouted for her to come out. I was able to see the headstone she ran behind. I would have seen her if she ran out again. I couldn't find her anywhere. I called my mom and told her what was going on. I asked her if I should call the police to tell them about this little girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old, so she certainly shouldn't be out here by herself. My mom asked me if she was wearing a little red dress, and I said yes. Why? She proceeded to tell me nonchalantly that there was a ghost girl that wore a little red dress that wandered the cemetery. Now everyone who knows me knows I'm terrified of ghosts. I asked why she didn't tell me there was a ghost in the cemetery. She said she needed my help and was afraid if I had told her, I wouldn't be out there helping her. Now granted, I probably would have been more leery of the place, but knowing no one else could help her, I still would have helped her that summer. but I would have made sure I wasn't there by myself. I still go there from time to time because I have relatives buried there, but I'm always with someone, fortunately. I never saw any other ghosts, and I have never seen the little girl ghost again. Horrifying plastics. I work at a graveyard, and I have just one thing to say. Plastic. Here in Norway, graves are protected by law for 20 years, but after that, the spot can be reused. Usually a grave is fine to reopen after 20 years, as the body is supposed to be decomposed and pretty much gone. Now back to plastic. Between the 50s and the 80s, it was common here to be buried in plastic to minimize smell and leakage. I'm sure they thought it was a good idea back then. But once we started to reuse the graves in Norway, we realized it was a curse. A lot of bodies were wrapped in plastic, and I myself had been part of what was supposed to be a burial at a reused site. The body was about 50 to 60 years old and should be basically gone, but nope, it wasn't. The plastic wrap it was covered in kept the body from decomposing, and it basically just marinated in its own juices for 50 to 60 years. The smell was awful. The sight was even worse. It's honestly the most terrifying and bizarre thing I've ever seen. She needed to get back. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in the reception office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoon to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the gate entrance, which was locked, and only staff could get in or out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines, begging us to let her back in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of New Jersey, so she needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went back up to get him. We brought him back to the gate and no one was there. We looked at the video footage of the entrance and you could see us, the officer manager and myself, talking, but there was no one else on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day that woman was there in a fancy dress outside the gate. There were multiple cameras, and not one single one picked up anyone else on the other side of the gate. You can see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. A deceased man thrashed in the cremation chamber. I've had a number of odd experiences with our crematorium. On one such instance, in 2012, following a service for a very large man, roughly around 375 pounds, I got the cremation chamber preheated while my wife set up a movie to watch while the man was being cremated. I used the elevation platform and then slid him in. Closing the doors to the chamber afterward, I went to sit down. About 5 minutes after I had shut the door to the chamber, we heard a thump. Neither of us paid it much mind, but a few moments later, there was another and another one. I stood up, worried that the man may have had a pacemaker still inside him, however unlikely because he had all of his organs removed. The thumping and the thudding got more hurried. We looked through the front window of the chamber and couldn't believe what we were seeing. The man inside was flailing about. Both of his arms and legs were bouncing around like he was in extreme pain. Now, it isn't odd to see parts of the body move while someone is being cremated. As the limbs are broken down, they will often contract as muscles and tendons snap. But this was most definitely not that. The man's fingers were balled up in fists, and he was banging against the window, and his legs seemed to be kicking downward, as if trying to get out. Then the man's mouth opened, and first groans began to come from within, then screams. There was no way, absolutely no way whatsoever, that he could still be alive. But for about 20 seconds after we had gone up to the chamber, the man inside screamed and flailed his arms and legs about. Someone stacked the caskets like a house of cards. My family owned a cemetery for nearly 5 generations, and I've been working there since I was 12. The house that my family built on the property is about 30 yards back from the main office. One night, when they were kids, my grandpa and uncle were up late. My uncle happened to look out the window and swore to my grandpa that he had seen someone walk behind one of the trees. The lamppost illuminated the first handful of plots and headstones on the other side of the road, but at that point they were undisturbed. My grandpa and uncle stood at their window for a little while, with my grandpa teasing my uncle for being scared. However, when they woke up the next morning, the police were there. In the hours between, when they looked out the window and saw the burial plots undisturbed, which was about 4 a.m., to the time they noticed the commotion, which was 7 a.m., 7 of the plots had been dug up. The headstones were stacked very deliberately, like a house of cards, and behind them the caskets were on top of one another. The first of the layers laid flat, the next one straight up, then flat, straight up, flat, then straight up, with the final one flat. With basic casket dimensions taken into account, that's nearly 30 feet high. I'm sure you can imagine, with even the machinery in the present day, that would take at least a bit of time to accomplish. But note, back in the 50s, this was somehow done in a span of less than 180 minutes, with no one that lived in the house able to hear or see anything going on. The Walking Dead. My husband used to work at a morgue, and the stories he'd come home with were something else. I've heard from others in the field of odd experiences of bodies sitting up, presumably from tightening muscles, and one account of a dead man walking part way down the hall before collapsing. This is my husband's story. He said that he stepped away after setting a body out to be cleaned and to be autopsied, then came back and saw that the body was gone. He was alone, and it was in the middle of the night, so no one could have taken it. He said he went to call the security guard that does the rounds to see if anybody had came or gone. Before he could, he thought he heard something in the hall. He thought he had gone crazy, when then he saw the body had collapsed in the hallway. And death's grip and moans of the dead. I used to work in tissue recovery. My least favorite part was preparing the donor for recovery, as it included shaving the arms and legs. Once we had a donor who was very freshly deceased. I held his hand and shaved his arm, and his fingers curled around my hand as rigor mortis set in. Now, if a corpse has a lung full of air, then moving them causes it to release. When the air travels through their throat, you get a minor vocalization, but usually it just sounds like a liquid gurgle. It still gives me the chills every time I work there alone. The corpse rises. My neighbor was a mortician. A while back he told me a story. One night he had a body he was preparing for a very early morning wake or service. Whatever was going on, it was unusual, and it required him to work into the wee hours of the morning on this particular corpse. So as he's working on it, he turned his back to grab some tools or supplies, and the angle he was standing at, the body was visible just out of the corner of his eye. As he was looking down at whatever tool he was getting, out of the corner of his eye he saw the body slowly starting to sit up. His fight or flight instinct immediately kicked in, and he ran to the stairs as fast as he could. But when he did so, clumsily trying to get up the stairs, he tripped and pretty much was clawing and crawling his way to the top. He was just near the top before his senses finally came back, and he knew it was rigor mortis. He collected himself and started to laugh at how absurd it was. He had been doing this for 15 to 20 years at this point, and he had never had a freakout like that before, where his instinct overtook knowledge and experience. Mystery of the Standing Man. Back in med school, during an internship at the coroner's office, I saw a case where a man in his late 50s was found dead at home, although under quite particular circumstances. His body was found standing, yes, standing in his bedroom with one leg raised as if resting on the bed, basically as if he wanted to climb into bed but suddenly died. Further examination led to a severe heart attack as one of the most likely causes of death. However, there was no evidence of someone trying to move the body post-mortem could be found. The conclusion was that either someone would have to have found him quite early and basically held the corpse for hours until it became stiff enough to stand on its own, or that his death was so sudden and it happened just in the right moment that his body would have to be perfectly balanced and not fall over. The sound of sobbing. My first experience at work was when I first started my embalming career. I had just started my shift and was using the restroom in the back. When I came out, I heard what sounded like a girl sobbing and the sound of feet shuffling on the floor. The floor was kind of gravelly and had a distinct sound if you scooted your feet on it. The sound was coming from around the corner that led to a room where we stored the embalmed bodies ready to be delivered to their respectful funeral homes. I figured someone was upset and was crying, so I snuck in, still hearing the sobbing. I peeked around the corner and the room was empty, no living person in there. I noticed there was only one body in there, the body of a young girl. She shot herself in the side of the head. It wasn't scary per se, but I'm pretty sure you could audibly hear my heartbeat.